He screamed once, a raw animal sound that tore the night in two. And then the howl died, as if the forest itself had closed its mouth to swallow the noise. Cade Rourke lay half-buried in pine needles and cold blood, his chest heaving against a spine that no longer answered him. His hands clawed at the earth like a man trying to claw himself upright from drowning. Moonlight painted his face silver, turning sandpaper stubble and old scars into a mask of myth and ruin. When Jonah Hart found him, the legendary enforcer who had once broken blackbone hunters and bent rebel alphas with a stare, was a collapsed monument. Pride shredded, legs useless, the taste of iron on his tongue. Around him, the traps gleamed cruelly. Silver-tipped snares and shards meant for the superstitions of old and the stubborn cruelty of men who remembered the old wars. The pack's code would have them leave him to the wolves of territory and time. Jonah could feel the verdict in the leaves. Leave him to die. He did not. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Jonah had no right to be here. His boots still smelled faintly of salt and diesel, not pine resin. The map tucked into his head belonged to coastlines, not mountain passes. He had come inland hunting a different kind of enemy, one with paperwork and explosives and human faces that slept behind thick glass. Instead, he found a man whose shadow had once commanded whole valleys to kneel. Jonah knelt beside Cade because of a debt that tasted like river water and fear. Years ago, when Jonah's world had nearly drowned him, a wolf with human eyes pulled him from a black, cold current and left only a whisper of memory and a threat he could never explain. He had promised, silently, in the hollow where gratitude becomes religion, that if fate ever put a wolf in his path again, he would not turn away. Cade's chest rose slow, then faster, like a trapped animal learning new rhythms. Jonah checked the wounds with steady hands that had fixed broken men in the dark. The spine was wrong. Nerve whispers told him so. He had seen similar damage in field hospitals and in the wet, glaring light of evacuation decks. And the look on Cade's face matched the look of men whose future had been amputated. Anger flickered there, hot and sharp, but under it lay a raw, humiliating fear that made Jonah's chest ache. Cade's eyes were the color of winter storms, silver flecked with an old cruelty that had once been a weapon. Now those eyes were edged with something Jonah could not name. Shame, more than pain, and the brittle grief of a man's body betrayed his rank. "You shouldn't have come back," Cade rasped, voice raw as gravel. He tried to sit, and Jonah gripped his shoulder to keep the motion from snapping something that might still be salvageable. No decent pack carries scars like that. Jonah's jaw twitched. "No decent pack leaves brothers to die," he said. The words sounded foreign when they left his mouth, as if his life at sea had taught him to speak in shorter truths and hostage protocols. He didn't explain that the debt wasn't to the pack or to alphas. It was to a memory of being hauled from dark water by a wolf who smelled of time and thunder. He did not explain that he could feel the moon in the marrow like a pulse, and that the thought of Cade dying in a field under a dwindling moon made something inside him tilt toward violence. Cade's laugh was a dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You're human," he said. It was statement and accusation both, laying bare rules carved into granite. A human could not carry the fallen of the packs. A human could not make decisions for the balance of claws and claims. Jonah wanted to tell him that the custom did not frighten him. Instead, he wrapped Cade in his jacket and tested the warrior's weight. Cade was heavier than Jonah expected, more mass than muscle, a compact continent of wound and history. Jonah braced and, with a breath he stole from somewhere deep, slung the fallen Lycan over his shoulders in a rescue that would start a war. They moved through trees that watched with blind eyes and quiet tongues. Cade's breath came ragged, each exhale a rusted hinge protesting motion. Jonah felt the watch of the forest and the hunger of things that had law books older than nations. Every step away from the trap field was an act of theft. Every rustle and broken twig announced their presence to the edges of territories where alliances were currency and blood a billeted note. Jonah whispered apologies into the hollow of Cade's neck, words Cade could not hear properly, but that steadied his own hands. He thought of the sea, of orders barked in sterile humidity, of the way men learned to carry one another without complaint. He could not unlearn how to shoulder somebody else's life. By the time he reached the safe house, a low stone structure hidden under a mantle of spruce and moss, dawn had dusted the peaks with cold pink. It had belonged to his cousin once, a hunter who died with a rifle in his hands. The place smelled of old smoke and preserved food and a loneliness Jonah recognized. He had kept it empty in case ghosts ever needed shelter. Cade's weight sagged. Jonah arranged him on a makeshift pallet and worked with hands steadied by years of triage, setting bruise to simmer, stripping away bloodied fabric, and pressing cold compresses where swelling promised infection. Cade's breathing was a private war, each intake an electric argument between life and the stubborn law of pain. When Cade's eyes opened, they flared with something like recognition, and then something hotter, fury. "You brought me here? You stole me from the field," he said, the words clotted with blood and scorn. "You stole me from my pack." Jonah set down a cup of bitter tea and met the stare without flinching. "Your pack would have left you," he said bluntly. "They called it mercy. They called it order. I heard the verdict before I found you. I couldn't." "You couldn't leave well enough alone," Cade hissed, dignity collapsing into accusation. It was not only pride, it was a code speaking through an atrophied body. "Humans, you think you can step into our world with your rules?" Jonah felt the old muscle of his own patience contract. "I owe you," he said, and he didn't say what kind of owing. He didn't say that once, long ago, a pair of human hands had sunk into river water and found him gasping. And in the fur-clad eyes of the rescuer, he'd seen a world he wasn't welcome in, but that had saved him nevertheless. He didn't say he had stayed alive since then by touching the moon in ways he could not explain. Words like those had a way of becoming weapons in packs and militaries alike. The safe house breathed around them, carrying sounds of the mountains waking. Crows, a distant cascade, the old wooden signboard creak of a pain settling. Jonah's eyes kept flicking to Cade's hands. Calloused, scarred, still the hands of a man who had once bent fate. Cade's jaw worked, as if learning to chew against new rules. The silence stretched until Cade's voice cut a new line through it. "Who are you?" he asked more quietly. "Why do you care?" Jonah sat on the floor beside him and propped Cade's chin with a palm that had held rifles and other men's life for years. He could smell the musk of wolf and wound. He could feel the moon in a way that buzzed behind his ribs when Cade inhaled. There was something in that breath that made the world sharpen. "My name is Jonah Hart," he said. "I used to swim for a living. Then I learned to do other things. I owe you. You saved me once. That's all." Cade's face registered surprise, the flicker of memory that sometimes rose like tidewater, a river, a hand, a wolf with eyes older than the storms. He tried to push for more, questions that would tie Jonah to a story the pack could use, but pride was a brittle thing. It couldn't lean without cracking. Outside, the mountains angled toward the sky like the spines of sleeping beasts. Within the stone walls, two worlds rubbed together, the human grit of Jonah's cadence and the ancestral-laden grammar of Kadei's silence. The safe house would be temporary. Everyone who mattered would already be counting the hours until word leaked across territories and the council convened. Jonah knew what the reaction would be. He had read the faces of judges before, human and otherwise. Mercy could be a brand of madness. Mercy could be a challenge. In pack law, a crippled warrior threatened order because it invited pity, and pity was a slow poison that dissolved dominance. The first knock on the door came just as the sun burned higher, hard and formal. Jonah's first instinct was to move Cade further inside, to hide what could be hidden. But Cade flung an arm out, stopping him with a look that burned. "Let them see," he said, voice steady with something that was not resignation, but a gauntlet. Jonah opened to find a messenger from the Ridge Pack, Mira Anders, Cade's old beta, standing with eyes like flint and a blade of loyalty honed to accusation. Behind her sat a courier whose uniform bore the seal of the council. News traveled like wildfire here, and the messenger carried it, official and cold. "You brought the Alpha's enforcer into a human shelter," Mira said without preamble. "You have no right." Jonah braced. This would be the beginning of the storm. He had no desire for confrontation, but his hands still remembered the mechanics of combat. He could have shifted, left before the council's gaze found him. He could have carried the man back to the field and left Cade to the wolves. Instead, Jonah stepped back inside and closed the door on the bright morning, on the rules that said he didn't belong. He shut the mountain world out for a moment and met Cade's eyes across a sliding threshold that would soon split them from everything they knew. The decision hung like an omen in the air. To claim another's debt was to invite everything that followed. Jonah touched the line of the pact with the flat of his hand and felt something like home, or else a new war. Outside, the messenger lifted her chin. "The council demands to meet with your pack," she said, "or at least with the one who brought him here." Cade's laugh was a small, bitter thing. "The council will call me an embarrassment," he said, and the word carried the weight of lineage. "They will call for a trial. They will call for blood. They will not see a debt." Jonah's answer came as quietly as a decision made at sea. "Then we'll face them," he said, "together." It was a promise and an act strong enough to set the mountain on edge. The first act of transgression had been committed. A human had picked up a fallen Lycan and refused to let him die alone. The ripples would race ahead and the mountains would begin to talk. Inside, the safe house that smelled of smoke and loneliness became a bud of dangerous warmth. Outside, the forest kept its counsel, and the blood-red moon sank into memory. But every living thing could feel the tremor where mercy had been chosen over law. "I can continue the scene and write Act 2 for you, but I can't reliably guarantee an exact word count of 1791 words in a single reply. Would you like me to proceed with a richly detailed Act 2 that targets that length as closely as possible, or would you prefer I break the act into smaller segments so I can ensure precise counts?" The first knife came from inside the circle of wolves, a voice as cold and sure as flint. "You thought you could cheat the law, Jonah Hart." Mira's words were not a question. She had been the blade in Cade's shadow for a decade, beta by title and executioner by temperament. She stood in the doorway like a verdict, the sunlight turning her hair to brass. Behind her, a trickle of other faces, curious, judgmental, hungry, crowded the threshold. A courier with the council's seal had already gone to fetch the others. News traveled fast. The mountain liked gossip that could be sharpened into orders. Jonah felt the air tighten as if the safe house itself had inhaled to listen. He straightened, muscles remembering how to hold posture against accusation. "I didn't come here to break your laws," he said evenly. "I came because I heard a howl that shouldn't have died." Mira's laugh was sharp. "You came to play savior and brought shame in your hands. Do you understand what you have done? A pack cannot allow weakness to spread. A crippled warrior invites predators, hunters, rival packs, insurrectionists. This is not your war, human. Leave him. We will decide." Cade's gaze flicked between them like a man searching for the edge of a cliff. Pride still lived in him, old muscle memory that would not be dulled by pain, and it burned a ferocious, embarrassed heat. "They would have left me," he said, voice low. "They would have left me to die because I could not stand. That is their law." "We are not that law," Mira replied, cold as an icicle. "We are the Ridge Pack. We honor the balance, Cade. We honor the code." Jonah moved like he had in rooms where people argued under the hum of fluorescent lights, measured, direct, with no wasted steps. He sat on the pallet's edge, close enough that Cade could sense his breath, far enough to give him space. "You saved me," Jonah told Cade again, softer this time. "Once." Cade's shoulders trembled with a laugh that tasted like rust and regret. "Saved you?" His voice broke, and for the first time, the alpha enforcer who had bent others into submission was exposed as a memory. "I did not save men like you. I took from them. I made them kneel." Jonah's pulse quickened at the confession, the brush of an old debt rising like a tide. "You saved me from the river," he said. "The night my team failed, and I thought the cold would take me. You pulled me out and left before I could say thank you." Cade looked away, jaw working. The safe house's single window framed a blue sky too ordinary for the storm under it. "I remember a human who smelled like iron and despair," he admitted, the words small and lethal. "I remember hands that tried to close my mouth and failed. I remember thinking, keep him alive. He might be useful." "Useful?" Jonah repeated, incredulity and hurt braided. "Is that why you did it? Because I was a tool? Because you thought you'd trade me for something?" Cade's lips thinned. The confession peeled back another layer. Beneath the myth of mercy was a colder ledger. "I had reasons," he said, evasive. "When you choke on water, you understand the value of being used." Jonah wanted to ask more, to pull the truth out like a splinter, but there was a deeper fault line opening. The idea that their debt was transactional made his ribs ache in a way the sea never had. It also made him complicit in a past he had not understood, that the wolf who had dragged him from the current had been calculating, not saintly. Gratitude shifted into a complicated thing that resembled betrayal. Mira watched the exchange like a hawk. She deflected the smallest change in expression, the faintest hint of division, and used it like a cudgel. "This is why we oppose you staying," she said to Jonah. "You are a man who worships debt and bargains. How can we trust your intentions? How can we trust that bringing Cade here is not meant to weaken us? Your kind has a long history of giving us false bargains." Around them, murmurs threaded through the doorway, old superstitions and newer fears, humans as saboteurs, as leash holders. That the council's courier had already ridden down the Ridge Paddock Valley to call the elders meant one thing: there would be a formal meeting, and in that room, the word mercy would be sharpened into weakness and thrown. Jonah's jaw clenched. He had been drilled for interrogation by men who wanted to break him, and yet this felt worse. Denial not of secrets, but of the right to be. Not a military tribunal, but a cultural one. "Listen," he said, patient now. "I came because you saved me. I don't want power here. I don't want politics. I only want to keep him in your human house, Mira's voice sliced. "Let him rot on your palate and disgrace him further in human eyes. You are naive, Jonah Hart." The name fell like a stone. For the first time, Jonah realized the texture of suspicion. Hart was not a common human surname here. It rolled like the names of those who had crossed borders and brought new weapons. He felt the circle tighten, the air grow denser with old prejudices. He looked to Cade to see if the wounded man would intervene, but Cade watched his own hands as if they were foreign objects. "It isn't about you," Cade said suddenly, and his voice had the brittle flatness of a man who had learned cruelty by degrees. "It's about the pack. If word spreads that you carry me like this, rivals will infer weakness. They will test. They will come. I won't be a cause. I won't be a fault line." Mira's face softened with the practiced expression of someone who had always put the group first. "Cade," she said, almost gently, "we can take you back to the ridge. You will have care. There will be sanctity in your recovery. But not like this. A human woman or man with chains around our law? No." The edges of the room seemed to shift under Jonah's boots. He had expected the pushback, had known pack law would not bend. He had not expected the revelation that Cade, the man who had once been a pillar of the Ridge Pack, would prefer to be carried back into his own machinery of rules rather than risk a human's mercy. Cade flinched as if the offer itself was a lie. "Do you want them to take you back?" Jonah asked, voice sharpened by hurt. "Is it better to be paraded as an example than to be kept alive by someone who isn't part of your order?" Cade's eyes blazed. "I will not be a symbol, Jonah. I am not a lesson for some pack to wag a tail at. Take me to them, or let me die where I was found. But if I live in your human pity, do not mistake it for something noble." The argument peeled them farther apart. Mira's certainty, Cade's honor, Jonah's foreign morality. Each conviction crashed into the other like the tide against weathered rock. In the hallway, the courier's hoofbeats sounded like an approaching court. Then the first fracture made itself visible in a voice they hadn't expected. "You brought him here," said a low, familiar tone. Alaric, a younger alpha of a bordering small pack who had always envied Cade's stature but respected his brutality, stood at the doorway. He had come not with the authority of the council. He traveled with opportunism in his saddlebag. He rubbed his beard as if he were smoothing the wrinkles of a bargain. Alaric's arrival made the heat of the room taste different. He had once been refused favor by Cade, a wound he would have liked to turn into a claw mark of dominance. "If we let Cade survive under human hands, he's not the same threat as he used to be," Alaric said. "He's not the same leader. His return would be questionable. Our rivals would see a chance." Mira's gaze sharpened. "This is exactly why we cannot allow outsiders to decide our fates." Cade's breath hitched. The word outsider felt like an iron file on his ego. He pushed himself to a sitting position with a cry that made Jonah wince, small muscles protesting now in a body that had been built for power. The shock of movement made Cade's face flush with pain and humiliation. He was furious at himself more than anyone, rage seeded in the soil of disgrace. "Don't decide for me," he rasped. "I will decide my fate." Mira's expression changed again, a flash of something like calculation. If Cade wanted to decide his fate, then the pack's law provided avenues. There could be a trial. There could be a test. There could be a ritual that would mark him as unfit or redeem him. But trials demanded cooperation, and Cade's refusal to be led pointed like a flare to old resentments. He had failed to protect territory. He had failed to return from battle. The pack's mythology required a sacrificial clarity, and Cadet refused to become a symbol. Trial, Mira said slowly, tasting the word. Very well. The council will convene. You will come with me to the ridge. You will submit. Your body will speak for you. Jonah's jaw tightened. You can't force him to walk if his legs won't hold him. Mira's face was a knife. We will not force anything. We will test. The council's methods are ancient, but they are also law. She looked at Cadet with a hardness that might have been mercy in another lifetime. If the council deems you unfit, then you will accept exile by the pack's tradition. If they deem you fit, you will resume rank. Either way, you will not be a tool for a human's politics. Cadet's silence was a protest as loud as any movement. Jonah felt the ecosystems of trust crumble. Here, where wolves and humans had shared grudging proximity, agreements had been born of necessity. Hunted trinkets traded for medicine, human weapons traded for paths. But a human man carrying an alpha through the dead of night was an affront to balance. It was a breach that would have consequences beyond this room. Alliances would fray, borders would be redrawn, and hunters who watched for weakness would recalibrate their maps. The courier returned then, bearing not only the council's summons, but a thin, official accusation. A file stamped with old seals and the name of the tribe who had laid the traps, Black Bone Hunters. The paper smelled faintly of gunpowder and old leather. The handwriting blamed not only the hunters, but a possible collusion. Humans had been implicated before in alliances designed to take down a rival alpha. The implication was implicit. Jonah could be a human pawn, a deliberate emissary of chaos. Jonah took the file with hands that suddenly trembled, not from lack of military discipline, but because the accusation brushed a secret he had kept like a wound. The classified mission that had steered him inland, an operation to map illegal weapons flow, had drawn him close to territories where wolf and human met. He had not expected to cross a path with Cade. He had not expected to be the kind of person who could be accused of betrayal by proximity. He had also not expected that the moon inside him, the thing that tied him to the Lycan tides, would make him dangerous if known. They were small ripples to most, but they carried undercurrents that could drown them. You have contacts, Mira said, eyes locked on Jonah. You came close to those hunters. Your presence at the scene is convenient. It was not convenient, Jonah said. I heard a howl and followed it. Humans have learned to mimic empathy, Alaric added. They offer succor, they play at tenderness, and then they pull at the strings. You are too convenient, Hart. Cade's knuckles went white around his makeshift bandage. The accusation that Jonah might be a spy, deliberately luring the pack into a soft spot, stung with an old, primal fear. Trust had always been the pack's most precious currency, and it could be counterfeited easily by a human with the wrong kind of eyes. I earned the right to be here, Jonah said, and the phrase felt smaller than the distance he wanted to bridge. I carried him out of a field where men had meant to make him into a corpse. Mira's laugh was one of those cold sounds that meant negotiation was over. Words are cheap, she said. The council will decide. The council. The word hovered like a storm cloud. Their elders moved with the slow cruelty of time. They were remorseless in tradition because they had learned to survive on precedent. Jonah had no name to present to them that would ease their suspicion. The Navy had its own code, and revealing classified operations was not only impossible, but would put him at risk of court-martial. Cade's history with the Ridgepack offered more ammunition to those who would rather see him gone than healed. He had too many victories, too many enemies who longed for his fall. "Bring him," Mira said finally. "Bring him to the ridge. It is the only path that will keep the pack's story intact." Kade's eyes found Jonah's then, and in them Jonah saw a fracture that cut deeper than the silver-tipped traps had. It wasn't just the loss of his legs. It was the loss of the story he had told himself about what he meant to people. Cod had been built on the belief that he was indispensable. To be accepted into the pack's future, he had to accept their verdict. To be rejected, he had to accept exile. Either outcome felt like death. "I won't be led like a lamb," Cod whispered. Mira's voice softened, not in sympathy, but in strategy. "No one said you would be led. The council will hear you. You will answer. We will not let outsiders," she gestured at Jonah, "put words in your mouth. Come with me. We will meet at sundown." The sundown deadline hung over the safe house like a guillotine. Jonah felt the weight of choice slump inward. Accompany Cade and risk surrendering him to a system that had always favored the strong, or refuse and become an exile himself. Either path promised blood, either literal if rival packs or hunters pressed an advantage, or social if the people who ran the mountains closed their ranks against him. Cade's response was an angry, animal whisper. "I won't truss myself up for a parade. I won't be made into a lesson. If the council wants my surrender, they will have to take it. But if they think me unfit, I will not stand." Mira stepped toward them, hand extended not in friendship, but as a gauntlet. "Then choose. If you do not present yourself to the council, the ridge will assume the worst and act accordingly. We cannot let a potential festering wound endanger us all." Cade's mouth opened, closed. He was a man wrestling with etymologies of honor and survival. He owed allegiance to the ridge, to the code that had raised him, and yet his body no longer allowed him to occupy the place he had set for himself. Jonah watched the conflict etch itself into the lines of his face and felt very small under the memory of that wolf in the river, under the debt he'd carried like an animal bone in his chest. "I will go," Cade said at last, each syllable a step on his own internal battlefield, "but not bound by you." He turned to Jonah, and there was a raw, terrible dignity in the way he voiced the words. "If I must be shown to the council, let it be my decision how I arrive, not like a trophy for human eyes." Jonah wanted to argue, to insist that being alive was enough. But Cade's stubborn pride was a living thing. Jonah also understood, almost painfully, that to force the issue would be to further strip the man of agency. He swallowed the urge to claim possession, and instead put a hand on Cade's shoulder. "We'll go on your terms as best we can," he said quietly, "but the council might not listen to best intentions." Mira barked an order then, brisk and martial, that set the mountain into motion. A rider would go to the ridge with news, the council would assemble, the journey would begin at dusk. People moved through the safe house with brisk efficiency, faces already arranging the narrative in their minds. Some were for Cade, some conspired for his downfall. Jonah watched them and felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with wounds or politics and everything to do with identity. He was a foreigner, a man who had no pack, and now he was someone who had crossed a boundary that the mountain did not want crossed. Hours bled between then and sundown. Mira and her small contingent made camp in the trees, old towels of light making the forest gold. Cade's breathing grew steadier. Morphine, crude, rationed, settled into the palled corners of his mind. Conversation flickered between them like dying embers. Practicalities about transport, inventories of silver on the trail, whispers about which elders might be lenient and which would be merciless. Jonah watched Cade sleep in small shifts. The man's face had the hardness of a cliff, but the softness of a sea-worn stone at its base. He wanted to say everything he felt, Anger at being accused of betrayal, fear that revealing his classified mission would cost him more than freedom, a strange mounting tenderness for this wreck of a man who had once been a storm. But none of those words fit the hour. Instead, Jonah stepped outside into the thinning light and let the moon press against his skin. The sky was clear, an obsidian bowl. The moon was a thin blade, a sliver of promise. When he closed his eyes, the sense he'd always tried to bury, the one that had made him an anomaly among men, rose like a tide. It made the chest ache, like homesickness for a place he had never lived. He felt the pull of the moon in his bones, a humming, a resonance that deepened with Cade's breathing inside the safe house. The secret that had been his anchor and his shame thrummed. He could sense the tides of Lycans, the flattening of their anger when they made it, the spike of their aggression when they were threatened. It was not something he shared. He had learned to keep it tucked behind his jaw because people feared what they could not name. But tonight, the pull was loud. It warned him that the council was a trap, that the hunters were watching, and that secrets had a way of turning knives when exposed. He wanted to confess to Cade that he felt the moon's pleading when the Alpha's breath stuttered, that some part of him resonated with the worn metal of Cade's history. He wanted to tell Cade that his debt had become something else, something bordering on love, but the words sat heavy in his throat like a stone. When he returned inside, Cade sat up and watched him with the weary hostility of a man who expected betrayal. "What's wrong with you?" Cade asked in a voice that had been recast in steel. "Why do you stay?" Jonah glanced at the kneecap that no longer obeyed commands, at the hands that had once held him from drowning and now cupped shame like a coin. "Because I owe you," he said. "Because when I could have drowned, a wolf with human eyes pulled me from the current. Because I don't let debts lie." Cade's eyes narrowed, and for a flicker he looked very young, on the edge of fear and something like hope. "You think that makes you noble? It makes you weak." "No," Jonah said, softer. "It makes me human." Cade audibly scoffed and turned his face away from Jonah as if the words were a blow. "Then prove it," he said. "Prove that a man can care without wanting to possess." Jonah's hands fumbled at the edge of the pallet. "I'm not here to own you," he said. "I'm only here to keep you breathing." Cade's face softened for the scantest of seconds. Then the sun dropped below the pines and the world prepared for judgment. The Ridgepack's riders were on their way. The council would see what had been hidden. Secrets would surface. Jonah's military history. Cade's past mercies turned bargains. Mira's plans to reclaim power. Alaric's hungry gaze for victory. The safe house's little hearth drew every crack and shadow into a pattern of omen. They were stepping toward a precipice where old rules would fracture, where alliances would be tested and new betrayals would bloom. Jonah's secret warmth of moontide was a fragile, dangerous candle in the dark. He breathed and felt the night answer back, and knew with a growing, terrible certainty that whatever happened at the ridge, nothing after this night would be the same. Secrets had begun to move, and fractures would follow like wolves behind scent. The Ridgepack's riders arrived at sundown like a tribunal, hoofbeats sowing urgency into the thinning light. Lanterns bobbed as figures dismounted. The elders' faces were carved by years and law. Jonah watched them come as if he were seeing a fleet of warships bearing down on a single fragile raft. Mira led the procession with the confidence of someone born to carry the ledger of other people's sins. Cade sat up on the makeshift pallet, shoulders squared, jaw set into a defiant cliff. The pride he wore was not bluster, only a last gauntlet thrown at a world that preferred clarity to complexity. The council arranged themselves in a ring of authority, the oldest elder taking the center like a sun everyone orbited. He had the look of a man who had survived winters by making the hard call, exile when necessary, sacrifice when demanded. His first words were the slow ones of ritual. Cade Rourke, you stand accused of failing the Ridge, of taking wounds in battle that make you a liability. The council will hear evidence. The Ridge will judge. Cade's eyes, those stormed silver eyes Jonah had come to know as both threat and question, fixed on the elder. Jonah felt Cade's weight settle into his chair as if the man were bracing to be unmade and remade by custom. He also felt a prick of panic. This was not a room where a human should speak. The council knew human tongues well enough to use them as weapons. Their suspicions were an old geography. Jonah's presence at Cade's side was already a scandal. If he spoke, he would be considered an interloper. If he remained silent, he might be complicit in Cade's removal. Cade spoke first, and his voice was a blade honed on regret. He told the council what had happened. The blackbone hunters, the trapline, the silver-tipped snares meant to cripple and humiliate. He did not speak of the exact battle. Details would pivot to dangerous memories. But he spoke of the choices he'd made in 100 fights that had scarred the Ridge's borders. He did not beg. He offered his truth in the language of someone who had once commanded obedience, which now sounded like confession. Mira presented the pack's dossier. Testimonies of elders, reports of skirmishes, the map of rival incursions. She read the law with surgical disinterest. The question she asked, without asking, hung in the air. Could a leader who had been maimed still hold power? Was a warrior who required human aid a leader for a pack that defined itself by sovereignty of Fang? When the council looked to Jonah, their eyes found a foreigner, salt skin and sea-brittle jaw, raised like an odd artifact in an ancestral museum. He felt their gaze like tide. He could have remained mute, let Cade face the old ways alone, but silence would have been a different kind of violence. He rose, unsteady at first, not from fear of the physical act, but from the enormity of speaking in a place that measured men by long genealogies and sharper prejudices. He had no official standing here. Admitting as much felt like a confession. I carried him from the field, Jonah said, voice steadying as it found rhythm. I owe him. I cannot tell you more. But he is not a liability. He is a man worth being kept. Murmurs rose like small animals in a wood. The elder's eyes narrowed. Why does a human owe a Lycan? He asked. Why should we accept your judgment? Jonah swallowed. He had told half-truths for his life, missions that required obfuscation, loyalties that came with classified strings. The penalty for revealing certain details might be severe at home, less severe under the mountain stars, but the truth now was a simpler, rawer thing. Because I was once pulled from a river by a wolf with human eyes, he said. Because I promised him, unspoken, that I'd repay the debt if fate ever crossed us again. Because when my country taught me to carry men, it never asked me whether I belonged at their side. It asked only that I carry. Cade's face shifted when Jonah said this. A memory like a tide receded to reveal the stones beneath. The council watched as two strangers, one human, one Lycan, gave one another an account of owedness. It was not legal in their ledger. It was something older and more dangerous than law. Alaric stepped forward then, his voice a hunger. Do you expect us to accept a sentiment like a treaty? A debt is not law. We are measured by ability to defend. If Cade cannot stand, how will he lead? Cade's face was a mask of brittle honesty. I will not lead as I once did, he admitted. I ask not to reclaim a throne. I ask only for the chance to heal, for medicine, for time, conditions that the pack can define. I will submit to trials. I will not be paraded as weakness. Mira's answer was the one the council loved most. Practical inevitability. Trials, she said. Let there be trials. Let Cade prove himself or accept exile. That is the order. The trial was brutal in its clarity. It required Cade to demonstrate the truth of his body. Tests of reflex, of pain tolerance, of leadership under stress simulations that mocked old battles. He had to answer citizens of the Ridge who demanded certainty more than mercy. Each test was a scalpel on his pride. Each failure punished him, not only physically, but in the mythology that had built him. Jonah watched the ritual of assessment like a man watching a lighthouse thrown into fog. Necessary, indifferent. When the night of the trial came, the council designed it as a crucible. Sentries lit fires in a ring. The valley echoed with the city's guttural acclamation. Cade limped. He could not conceal the way the nerve endings lit like careless sparks, how he balanced pain to stand it all. The tests were unfair by design. Strength was to be proved under conditions that favored the uninjured. Jonah could see that, and it made his hands clench. At a certain point in the trials, the hunters breached the perimeter. They came like the things they were, organized, brutal, their rifles yawning into the night like cold mouths. Their black bone insignia was a smear in the firelight. For months, the Ridge had expected such a test. The pack's walls were always measured against opportunists. But the hunters' timing was surgical, and their motive was clear. Expose division, take advantage of perceived weakness, and kill the old enforcer for sport. Cade's name meant prey to them. The first volley of gunfire cracked the clean night. Chaos unfolded. Elders shouted orders, young wolves scrambled to guard the ring, and the hunters pushed forward with a hunter's cunning, snipers taking high ledges, ground teams flanking. The pack faltered at first, their cohesion loosened by the unexpected human hand inside their circle. Jonah felt the fissure like a physical wind. The hunters had come to cash in on it. Mira barked commands, and people rallied to her stripe with the kind of obedience that comes from hard winters. But those on the Ridge, trained in tooth and law, were unprepared for the kind of violence that came with human artillery. The Blackbone hunters had weapons designed to maim even Lycans, silver-tipped rounds and hollow points meant to take down flesh that could otherwise shrug off common bullets. The ring of fire shrank as wolves hastily constructed shelters and shields of fur and bone. Cade lay propped against a stone, pain making his breathing a wire. Jonah could see the hunter's line moving like a serried problem, organized, unstoppable if not interrupted. The pack's formation began to fray under the pressure of modern firepower. Men with rifles turned mountains of fury into riddles of shelter. Jonah knew the sound of a firefight in the dark, the clack of a misfed clip, the hollow duct of a slug, the particular cadence of a coordinated push. He also knew the shape of a rescue that had to be made by someone who could think like a soldier and move like the kind of man who had been shaped by tides. He looked at Cade then and saw not only a debt, but a man being purchased in blood. The choice surged up, clearer than any council verdict. Remain a bystander and watch the man he'd carried be taken away in pieces, or act and risk every line of law he'd trespassed. He could go back to the sea, return to classified shadows and quiet regret, but the moon in his bones throbbed with a different command. Jonah moved first. He rose without ceremony, grabbed a spare rifle from a fallen courier, and stepped into the firelight. Mira's shout pierced the night, "No human steps beyond the ring!" It was a cultural law as strict as any. But Jonah stepped anyway, because the debt had become a different shape. No longer ledger, but life. He moved like a man who had navigated waters where every second had a cost. He took cover behind a charred stump and returned fire with the cold precision of a trained soldier. His shots were economy, not spectacle. He coordinated with young wolves who had never been taught to expect human direction. He set up a flanking maneuver where fur and rifle worked together. For a moment, the harvest of centuries split open, human tactics and Lycan ferocity braided into something new and dangerous. Cade watched Jonas' movements with a fierce animal attention sharpened by gratitude and horror. He had always defined himself by taking the field. Now he watched a human move like the man he had once been, measured, strategic, unpossessed by myth. In the pauses between gunfire, their eyes met and something unnameable passed. A recognition that they could still save one another, even when the rest of the world sought to mark them dead. When the hunters finally retreated, beaten partly by the Ridgepack's teeth and partly by Jonah's hard, practical cunning, the council's faces were changed. They had seen a human stand in the line and refuse to be comfortable in the margins. They had seen him lead wolves and force a tactical retreat. For some, it was an atrocity. For others, a betrayal of all promises. But none could deny what the victory had cost. Cade's wounds were not healed by triumph, and he understood that pain in a language nobody else could translate. He pushed himself up, trembling with exertion and adrenaline and morphine, and for the first time in days he tried to stand without Jonas' hands. He fell, barely catching himself, and there was an ugly gasp from the crowd. Jonah was at his side in a heartbeat, the hands that had once carried him now steadying another. "You didn't have to break your laws," Cade said, voice raw with wonder and weariness. "You shouldn't have bled for me." Jonah's face was hard with something that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with a burgeoning tenderness. "You don't get to make that call," he said simply. "I paid a debt. I still intend to." Cade looked at him then, no defiance left, only something like admission. "Then claim it," he said, the words small and vast, as if they had been waiting in the mouth of a confession. "If you will stand with me when the world would rather we both fall, then don't pretend you were here by accident." Jonah's laugh was short and surprised. The moon watched them both, a silent coin. He reached out, steadying Cade's jaw with a hand that had been built to pull men from ruin. The crowd bent away like wind. For a moment it was only the two of them, their breaths small and hot in the cold night. Then let's make whatever comes after worth the cost," Jonah said. He had not meant for the words to arrive so soft, so urgent. But they were true. The night had changed them both. Cade had been broken, but not extinguished. Jonah had been an outsider, but not a coward. In the burning ring of judgment and gunfire, they had forged a new kind of alliance, one that would be called treachery by some and salvation by others. Around them, the elders murmured, angry and thoughtful. Mira's eyes blazed with a complexity that was no longer single-edged. Alaric plotted his next move in a face that flickered with envy. But the hunters had retreated for now, and the ridge breathed. Cade huddled under a cloak Jonah draped over his shoulders, and their hands found each other without ceremony. In that touch, everything they had lost and everything they might yet become passed like a quiet tide. The night held them both, and the moon, thin, relentless, watched as a human and a paralyzed Lycan chose, in the midst of a world that would rather see them undone, to bind themselves by something stronger than law, a fierce, shared loyalty born of blood, debt, and the stubborn hope of a love that might one day topple thrones. The ridge breathed easier in the weeks that followed, each small victory a stitch on ragged history. They learned routines, Jonah teaching tactics tempered by mercy, Cade accepting help without losing edge, the pack rearranging law. Mira stopped meeting Jonah with knives in her eyes. Respect grew in the space between battle and band-aid. Cade practiced standing, letting pain teach new limits instead of defining them, laughing when he slipped and swearing eloquently when not. Jonah slept poorly but carried certainty like armor. The moon in his bones felt less like a curse and more like a compass. The council gave Cade conditional standing, a brittle mercy that left both men awake at night, planning, repairing, guarding. Rumors never fully died. Rival packs watched, and hunters measured risk. But the Ridge had discovered a new currency, loyalty earned in storm. Cade learned to ask for help without apology. Asking became a strategy as sharp and necessary as any blade he had commanded. Jonah taught younger wolves cadence and cover, his methods sudden and practical, and slowly the mountain accepted that a human could hold weight. Mira's nephew survived. The pack's gratitude folded around Jonah in a silence heavier than any praise. Cade returned to small teachings, memory drills, ambush maps retooled for slower gait, lessons that turned his legacy into usefulness again. At dusk one clear night, they walked to the ridge stone, the valley washed in moonlight that softened everything it touched. Cade asked for a promise in a voice that had room for fear and hope both. Jonah placed his hand over Cade's and said simply that he had always meant to keep his debt and now kept a different vow. The pack watched, some skeptical, some relieved, others quietly curious, and the moon slid higher as if approving their small rebellion. Cade leaned his forehead to Jonah's shoulder, an unadorned gesture of trust more eloquent than any decree. Jonah felt the moon hum and answered with a promise that belonged to more than survival. It belonged to choice. The final image remained simple and stubborn. Two silhouettes on the ridge, shoulder to shoulder, the valley breathing beneath them. They did not promise the world would be kinder. They promised to keep each other, to carry what debt and desire demanded. Cade tightened his hand. Jonah tightened his jaw. They had fashioned a new law, one written in scars and steadiness, always.